Blood stained the hem of Evelyn Sterling's $10,000 Dior gown as the glass ceiling shattered around her. The billionaire CEO was seconds away from death when a stranger pulled her from the wreckage, pressed a makeshift tourniquet to her chest, and vanished into the sirens. She never saw his face. At 34, Evelyn Sterling had built an empire out of steel glass and sheer ruthlessness. As the CEO of Sterling Global Holdings, her net worth hovered around $4.20 billion. She was known on Wall Street as the Ice Queen of real estate, a woman who could dismantle a rival corporation with the same cold precision she used to order her morning espresso. She lived a life insulated by private jets, bulletproof Maybach, and an army of tailored security personnel. But on the evening of October 12, none of that mattered. The occasion was the grand unveiling of the Sterling Apex, a 70-story architectural marvel in the heart of downtown Seattle. The penthouse atrium, enclosed in a massive geodetic glass dome, was packed with the city's elite mayors, senators, and tech billionaires. Clinked champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the man in the grease-stained overalls working in the service corridors just 2 floors below. His name was Arthur Pendleton, or at least that was the name on his forged driver's license. Arthur wasn't supposed to be working the night shift. As a freelance structural contractor, he usually avoided high-profile gigs. But his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was asleep in his rusted Ford F-150, parked in the underground loading dock, clutching a worn teddy bear. Lily had a congenital heart defect. The medication she needed cost $2,000 a month out of pocket. Arthur took every cash-in-hand job he could find, living entirely off the grid to hide from a ruthless, wealthy former father-in-law who had vowed to take Lily away from him using endless legal warfare. Arthur had nothing left but his daughter and his anonymity. At 9:15 p.m. Arthur was wrenching a faulty pressure valve in the HVAC system when he noticed something chilling. Tucked behind the main ventilation shaft, flashing with a faint rhythmic red LED, was a Militara C4 charge wired to a commercial detonator. Arthur's blood ran cold. He had seen these before during his time deployed in Fallujah. He didn't have time to call the police. He didn't have time to trigger the fire alarms. He had seconds. He sprinted up the concrete service stairwell, bursting through the velvet-lined doors of the penthouse atrium just as Evelyn Sterling stepped up to the acrylic podium to deliver her keynote address. She looked immaculate, wearing a dark emerald gown, her piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd. Standing a few feet behind her was Richard Croft, her chief operating officer and rumored fiancé. "Evelyn," Arthur roared, his deep voice cutting through the polite applause. Security guards immediately lunged toward the scruffy, broad-shouldered man, but they were a fraction of a second too late. The explosion didn't just happen. It consumed the room. The blast wave ripped through the lower floor, instantly blowing out the structural supports of the podium. The concussive force shattered the massive geodetic glass dome above, raining thousands of jagged dagger-like shards down onto the screaming crowd. Evelyn was thrown violently backward. She slammed into a marble pillar, the breath leaving her lungs in a sharp gasp. Disoriented ears ringing with a deafening whine. She tasted copper. She looked down and saw a massive shard of structural glass protruding from her upper right chest, perilously close to her subclavian artery. The blood was pumping out in terrifying rhythmic spurts. She was dying. Clear's throat. The realization hit her with absolute clarity. The crowd was a stampede of panic, trampling over one another in the smoke and darkness. Her security detail was either dead or lost in the chaos. Richard was nowhere to be seen. Clear's throat. Then out of the choking gray dust, a figure emerged. It was Arthur. His face was smeared with soot and blood from a deep gash on his forehead. He dropped to his knees beside her, his calloused hands moving with terrifying efficiency. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice, a low, steady rumble that anchored her in the madness. "Keep your eyes on me." Evelyn couldn't speak. She stared up into his eyes. They were a striking stormy gray, carrying a weight of profound sorrow, but completely devoid of panic. Without hesitation, Arthur ripped the sleeves off his thick flannel shirt. "This is going to hurt," he grunted. He packed the fabric tightly around the glass shard, applying immense, agonizing pressure to her chest to stem the arterial bleeding. Evelyn screamed a choked, broken sound and weakly grabbed his wrist. "Don't leave," she managed to whisper, her vision fading at the edges. I've got to you, Arthur said softly, holding the pressure. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy leather belt, wrapping it around her shoulder and under her arm to create a makeshift pressure dressing. Suddenly, the wail of emergency sirens pierced the night. Heavy boots pounded up the service stairs. Seattle SWAT and paramedics were arriving. Arthur froze. Police meant ID checks, fingerprints, national databases. If he was caught, the authorities would realize his identity was fake. The wealthy family he was hiding from would find him. They would take Lily. Arthur looked down at the billionaire CEO. Her bleeding had slowed to an ooze. She would live. I'm sorry, he whispered. Before Evelyn could protest, Arthur stood up, grabbed his tool belt, and faded backward into the thick, swirling smoke. By the time the first paramedic reached Evelyn's side, the man with the stormy gray eyes was gone, leaving nothing behind but the blood-soaked flannel shirt saving her life. Evelyn woke up 3 days later in the VIP intensive care wing of Harborview Medical Center. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile white room. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the lead trauma surgeon, stood at the foot of her bed holding a tablet. You are exceptionally lucky, Miss Sterling. Clears throat, the doctor said, her tone serious. The glass severed a major vein, but missed the artery by a millimeter. Whoever applied that makeshift tourniquet knew exactly what they were doing. If he had hesitated for even 30 seconds, you would have bled out on that floor. Evelyn touched the thick bandages strapped across her chest. The memory of the blast was fragmented. A blur of fire and screaming, but one image remained burned into her mind with absolute clarity. Those steady, stormy, gray eyes looking down at her, and the rough, calloused hands that had held her together. Where is he? Evelyn asked, her voice raspy. We don't know, Dr. Jenkins replied. The police assumed he was part of your security detail. When they tried to look for him, he had vanished. The hospital room door opened and Richard Croft hurried in. He was impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit holding a bouquet of white lilies. He rushed to her side, his face twisted in practiced concern. Evie, thank God. Richard breathed, taking her hand. I was terrified. The blast knocked me unconscious. When I woke up, they had already loaded you into the ambulance. Evelyn withdrew her hand slightly. Something felt wrong. Richard's suit was immaculate. His hair was perfectly styled. He didn't look like a man who had survived a bombing and desperately searched for the woman he claimed to love. He looked like he had been watching the news from a hotel bar. I want my security, Chief, Evelyn demanded, ignoring Richard's flowers. Within the hour, Brody, a massive former Navy SEAL who ran Sterling Global's private security, was standing at attention by her bed. Brody, I want the man who saved me. Evelyn ordered, the ICE returning to her voice. Check the contractor logs, the catering staff, the security footage, everything. We already are, boss, Brody said, pulling out a file. But it's a ghost hunt. The EMP from the blast wiped the security servers in the penthouse. All we found at the scene was this. Brody placed a plastic evidence bag on Evelyn's lap. Inside was the torn piece of bloody flannel. We ran a fiber analysis, generic brand sold at 100 different hardware stores. The police are calling the bombing an act of domestic terrorism, but they have no leads. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I don't care about the police. I have billions of dollars at my disposal. Put out a public bounty. 1 million to the man who saved my life or to anyone who can bring me his identity. Richard stepped forward, his jaw tight. Evelyn, be reasonable. The police need to handle this. You're inviting every con artist in Seattle to come out of the woodwork. Besides, the man is probably just a panicked waiter. We need to focus on the company. The stock took a massive hit this morning. Evelyn stared at Richard, a cold realization settling over her. He was more concerned about the stock price than the fact someone had tried to murder her. Do it, Brody, she commanded. Across town, in a Clear's throat, damp, poorly heated motel room in Tacoma, Arthur Pendleton sat on the edge of a lumpy mattress. The television in the corner was muted, flashing. Breaking news graphics, billionaire CEO offers $1 million reward for mystery savior. Arthur stared at the screen, a heavy knot forming in his stomach. He looked down at his left arm wrapped in a cheap drugstore bandage where falling debris had severely burned him. "Daddy," Arthur turned. Lily was awake, rubbing her eyes. She looked incredibly pale, her breathing shallow. The cold dampness of the motel was making her condition worse. "Hey, sweetheart," Arthur said, forcing a warm smile as he walked over and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. "How are you feeling?" "My chest hurts," she whispered. Arthur closed his eyes, his heart breaking. The specialist had told him 2 weeks ago that Lily's valve was failing faster than anticipated. If she didn't get the specialized surgery in Switzerland, soon a procedure costing upwards of $250,000, she wouldn't survive the winter. He looked back at the television. $1 million it was enough to save Lily's life. It was enough to buy them new identities, a home in a warm climate. Peace. All he had to do was walk into the Sterling Global headquarters and say, "It was me," but he couldn't. Arthur reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small metallic object. When he had tackled Evelyn to the ground, his hand had brushed against the podium's destroyed wiring, and he had instinctively grabbed the detonator pin that had triggered the blast. He had examined it closely over the last 3 days. It wasn't a terrorist's crude pipe bomb trigger. It was a sophisticated encrypted RF receiver. But more importantly, etched into the side of the metal casing, barely visible to the naked eye, was a serial number. Arthur had spent hours on a burner laptop tracking the serial number through dark web military surplus boards. He traced the purchase order to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A shell company wholly owned by Richard Croft. The man who tried to kill Evelyn Sterling was her own second in command. Arthur realized with a chilling certainty that the $1 million reward wasn't just a beacon for him. It was a trap. If he stepped into the light to claim the money, Richard Croft would know exactly who he was. Richard would realize Arthur had seen the bomb and perhaps that Arthur possessed the physical evidence linking him to the assassination attempt. Richard wouldn't hand over $1 million. He would send a hit squad to silence Arthur and Lily forever. Arthur crushed the metal pin in his fist. He couldn't go to the police, they would run his fingerprints and hand Lily over to his monstrous machine laws. He couldn't go to Evelyn. Richard controlled access to her. He was trapped in the shadows, holding the deadliest secret in the city, while the woman whose life he saved unwittingly painted a massive target on his back. The rain in Seattle was relentless, hammering against the reinforced bulletproof glass of Evelyn Sterling's temporary penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. 2 weeks had passed since the bombing at the Sterling Apex. The physical wounds on her chest were healing into jagged pink scars, but the psychological fractures were splitting wider every day. Evelyn sat in the dimly lit study, the glow of 3 encrypted monitors illuminating her pale, sharply contoured face. Richard Croft, her supposed fiancé and chief operating officer, had been acting erratically. He was pushing aggressively to liquidate assets, citing market instability following the blast. He wanted to transfer nearly $800 million into a subsidiary holding firm based in Luxembourg. Evelyn wasn't just a billionaire by inheritance. She was a predator in the boardroom. She smelled blood in the water. "Brooded," Evelyn said, not taking her eyes off the screen. The massive security chief stepped out of the shadows by the mahogany double doors. "Yes, boss. I want a deep dive forensics audit on Richard's personal offshore accounts. Specifically, look for a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Bypass the company's internal auditors and use the private Israeli firm we retained for the hostile takeover of Vanguard Tech last year. I want every SWIFT transfer, every wire, every encrypted email." Brody frowned, his heavy brow furrowing. "You think Croft had something to do with the Apex blast?" "I think Richard is terrified of something," Evelyn replied coldly. "And terrified men make mistakes."